The world ended not with a bang, but with a tired geologic sigh. The supervolcano beneath Yellowstone, the nation's slumbering monster, had finally stirred. It didn't erupt in the cinematic explosive way everyone had feared. It just opened up. Fissures miles long split the earth, vomiting a thick, relentless cloud of ash that choked the sun and buried the world in a monochrome shroud. The sky turned to slate, and the air a constant taste of sulfur and rock dust. Our final lurching miles to the Granite Peak Lodge were a crawl through purgatory. The old Ford F-250, Doyle's rust bucket pride and joy, groaned in protest, its tires churning through ash that had the consistency of wet cement mixed with ground glass. It was nearly a foot deep on the mountain pass, a uniform, suffocating blanket over everything. The skeletal arms of pine trees, heavy with the gray burden, drooped over the road like mourners at a global funeral. A profound, unnatural silence pressed in on the truck's cab, broken only by the engine's whine and the rhythmic squeak of the wipers smearing a gritty film across the windshield. Inside, the five of us were packed tight, a miserable collection of strays. Doyle, the old resort mechanic, gripped the wheel with gnarled knuckles, his face a roadmap of grim concentration. Beside him sat Reed, a Boston finance guy in a $1,000 ski jacket that was now as gray as everything else. He stared out the window, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. In the back, I was crammed between Ella and Nora. Ella, the med student, was methodically cleaning a pair of glasses that would be dirty again in 5 minutes, a small act of order in a world of chaos. Nora, the quiet history grad student, just watched the dead landscape slide by, her expression lost and distant. And me, Cameron, former park ranger. I was supposed to be the expert out here, the one who knew the land. But this wasn't land anymore. It was a tomb. "See it?" Doyle grunted, his voice raspy from the air. Through the swirling ash, a silhouette began to resolve itself. Granite Peak Lodge. It wasn't just a building. It was a fortress of Douglas fir logs and river stone, a monument to a time when people came to these mountains for pleasure. Its steep-pitched roofs were designed to shed feet of snow, and now they sagged under the weight of an eternal winter of ash. It looked like a beached ark on a dead sea, but to us, it was the promised land. Doyle managed to coax the truck up the final incline into the main parking lot, where half-buried luxury SUVs lay like sleeping whales. The moment he killed the engine, the silence crashed back in, heavier than before. For a moment, nobody moved. The simple act of arriving felt monumental. "All right," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness. "Let's not stand around admiring the view. Doyle, you and I check the main entrance. Reed, stay with Ella and Nora. Keep your eyes open." Reed shot me a look, a mix of resentment and fear. "Looking for what?" "The welcome committee." "Just do it," I said, not having the energy for an argument. The ash crunched under my boots with a sickening sound like walking on tiny bones. The cold was immediate and invasive, a damp chill that had nothing to do with snow and everything to do with the complete absence of sunlight. We found the main doors, huge things of carved wood and iron, unlocked. They swung open on a gust of stale, contained air. The grand lobby was a cavern of shadows. A 3-story stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and dark. Antler chandeliers, now coated in a fine layer of dust, hung like prehistoric skeletons from the vaulted ceiling. Moonlight, or whatever passed for it in this new twilight, filtered weakly through the tall plate glass windows, illuminating floating motes of dust in the gloom. It was eerie, but it was solid. It was shelter. "Home sweet home," Doyle muttered, pulling a heavy-duty flashlight from his belt. We spent the next hour sweeping the ground floor. The place was deserted. It seemed the evacuation, when it came, had been orderly. There were no signs of panic, just a hurried departure. The air of forgotten luxury was everywhere. Velvet chairs in the lounge, polished tables in the cavernous dining hall, a grand piano on a raised dais, its lid closed. The real prize was the kitchen. It was a stainless steel labyrinth, and behind it, a walk-in pantry. My heart hammered against my ribs when I saw the shelves. Canned goods, industrial-sized containers of beans, peaches, corn, tuna, bags of rice and pasta thicker than my arm, enough to last us for months if we were careful. "Well, I'll be damned," Reed said, his cynicism momentarily forgotten as he stared at the bounty. For the first time in days, the knot of hunger in my stomach eased. While Reed and the women started taking inventory, I followed Doyle down to the basement. It was a maze of pipes and concrete, smelling of damp earth and machine oil. In a caged-off room, we found it, a diesel generator the size of a small car. "She's a beast," Doyle said, running a loving hand over the engine block. "Cummins, best there is. Fuel tank's gotta be out back, near the maintenance shed." He tapped a gauge. "Looks like there's still a little in her service tank. Maybe enough to get her humming." He went to work, his movements economical and sure. He was in his element here, coaxing life back into dead machinery. I left him to it and went back upstairs. Night fell, not that it made much difference to the perpetual gloom outside. But inside, it brought a deeper chill. We gathered wood, smashing apart ornate lobby chairs and tables with a fire axe I found in a service closet. Soon, a real fire was roaring in the massive stone hearth, a defiant, crackling beacon of orange against the oppressive gray. The light pushed back the shadows, making the cavernous room feel smaller, safer. We huddled around it, eating cold beans straight from the can, the warmth of the flames a desperate luxury on our faces. "I was in Boston," Reed said, staring into the fire. "At my desk. We saw the news alerts, but nobody thought it would be like this. The sky just went dark in the middle of the afternoon. Then the ash started. The panic. I just got in my car and drove west. Don't know why. Just away from the cities." Ella spoke next, her voice soft. "I was on a clinical rotation. The hospital was chaos. The ash was like fine dust at first. People with asthma were the first to come in, then everyone. It overwhelmed everything in hours. I left with a group, heading for higher ground. We got separated." Nora just shook her head, pulling her knees to her chest. "I was already here, in a small cabin a few miles away, researching local folklore for my dissertation. I just stayed inside until the food ran out. Then I started walking. They all looked at me. I was on duty," I said, the memory tasting like acid. "Coordinating evacuations near the park's east entrance. We were trying to get people through Beartooth Pass before the ash got too thick. We didn't make it. The road just disappeared. Some of us got turned around, the rest." I trailed off, the images of stranded cars and desperate faces flashing behind my eyes. The guilt was a physical weight. Suddenly, a series of fluorescent lights flickered overhead, sputtered, and then hummed to life, casting a sterile, buzzing glow over the room. We all looked up, startled. A moment later, Doyle appeared from the stairwell, wiping greasy hands on a rag. "Let there be light," he said, a rare, thin smile on his face. A ragged cheer went up from our small group. It was a small victory, a tiny pinprick of light in an endless darkness, but it was ours. Huddled in the grand, empty lodge with a fire at our backs and electricity humming through the walls, a fragile, dangerous thing began to take root in my chest. Hope. We were safe. We had food, shelter, and warmth. We were going to survive. The first few days were a blur of work, a frantic but focused effort to turn the lodge from a temporary shelter into a defensible home. Routine became our shield against the crushing reality of the outside world. We boarded up the ground floor windows with planks pried from the ski rental shop, leaving only small, defensible peepholes. We organized the pantry, a task Reed took to with an accountant's obsessive fervor, creating spreadsheets of our supplies on the back of old menus. Ella set up a small infirmary in one of the offices, her medical kit neatly arranged on a desk. We were building a new miniature civilization within the walls of Granite Peak. Doyle was the heart of our operation. He got the generator running for 3 hours every evening, a precious window of light and power we used to cook on the kitchen's electric stove and listen to the static hiss of the shortwave radio, hoping for a voice that never came. He was a magician with machines, his quiet competence a steadying presence. There were 6 of us then. The 6th was a young woman named Chloe, a solo traveler who had been caught in the initial ashfall while hiking. We'd found her on the road, dazed and hypothermic, a day before we reached the lodge. She was quiet, almost ghost-like, her eyes holding a permanent state of shock. She rarely spoke, mostly just sketching in a small notebook she always carried. She ate with us, worked with us, but remained apart, locked in her own private trauma. On the morning of the 5th day, she didn't show up for our daily ration distribution. "Anyone seen Chloe?" I asked, scanning the small group gathered in the dining hall. Blank stares. A knot of unease tightened in my gut. "Probably just sleeping in," Reed said with a shrug. "Some of us aren't exactly early risers." "I'll check her room," Ella offered, her brow furrowed with concern. She was back in 5 minutes, her face pale. "Her bed hasn't been slept in. Her pack is still there, but her jacket and boots are gone. And her notebook." An unspoken dread settled over the room. "All right," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "Reed, you're with me. We'll do a sweep of the building first, then check the immediate perimeter." "Out there?" Reed's voice was sharp with disbelief. "In that? What's the point?" "The point," I said, meeting his gaze, "is that we don't leave anyone behind. Not now, not ever." We searched the lodge top to bottom, our flashlights cutting beams through the dusty, silent rooms. Nothing. The place was vast, a labyrinth of guest wings, conference rooms, and service corridors, but it was empty. The cold dread in my stomach grew with every vacant room we cleared. Finally, there was nowhere left to look but outside. We bundled up, pulling masks over our faces to filter the worst of the ash, and stepped out through a service door. The cold was a physical blow. The ash was falling thicker today, a soft, sound-dampening curtain that reduced visibility to less than 50 feet. It was like being inside a snow globe filled with gray dust. We started a circular search pattern moving out from the main building. It was Reed who found her. He'd rounded the corner to the west wing, where the main guest lounge was located with its floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows. I heard him make a choked, guttural sound and rush to his side. Chloe was lying in the ash, a few feet from the building. One of the huge panes of glass was shattered, a gaping black hole in the wall of the lodge. She was on her back, her arms flung wide, her open eyes staring up at the slate-gray sky. Her bright red ski jacket was a shocking slash of color against the monochrome world. "God, oh God," Reed stammered, taking a step back. I moved forward cautiously, my ranger training kicking in, pushing the horror down. The first thing I noticed was the lack of tracks. The fresh layer of ash was smooth, almost undisturbed, except for one set of footprints, Chloe's. They led from a side door we'd overlooked and ended right where she lay. There were no other marks, no signs of a struggle, no animal prints, nothing. It was as if she had walked out here, stood for a moment, and then simply died. "It must have been a grizzly," Reed said, his voice shaky but insistent. "Woke up from hibernation, starving. It smashed the window, she ran out, and it got her." I shook my head, kneeling beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene. "No, Reed? Look. A grizzly would have left tracks the size of dinner plates, there's nothing. And the ground, a bear attack is a maelstrom. The ash would be churned up everywhere." I looked closer at Chloe. Her body was wrong. She wasn't mauled or eaten. Her jacket was torn open, and across her torso were 3 deep, parallel gashes. They were clean, precise, like they'd been made with surgical scalpels. There was surprisingly little blood, just dark stains that had frozen on the fabric. We brought her back inside, wrapping her in a heavy blanket. The mood in the lodge plummeted from fragile hope to stark terror. Ella did the examination in the makeshift infirmary, her face a mask of professional detachment that did little to hide the horror in her eyes. Reed, Nora, and I waited in the hall. After a long, silent 20 minutes, she came out, pulling off her latex gloves. "It wasn't a bear," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Reed, you were right to think of an animal, but this isn't like any animal I've ever read about." "What do you mean?" I asked. "The wounds," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "They're incredibly deep and precise. They slice through muscle and bone. The force required would be immense. But the edges of the wounds are clean, not torn like you'd see from teeth or claws. And the spacing, they're perfectly parallel, about 4 inches apart. Whatever did this, it wasn't a frenzy. It felt methodical." She swallowed hard. "There's something else. I can't be sure without a proper lab, but the tissue around the wounds, it looks almost desiccated. As if something didn't just cut her, but leached the life, the warmth, right out of her. A deep, primal cold that had nothing to do with the temperature settled in the room." We looked at the broken window, now hastily boarded up with plywood from the inside. Something had come for us. It had smashed through a pane of reinforced glass, killed one of our own with surgical precision, and then vanished without a trace into the gray, silent world. Reed's theory of a starving bear was terrifying, but it was a known quantity, a monster we could understand. This was something else entirely. An unknown predator was hunting in the ash, and we were trapped in its territory. Our fortress suddenly felt like a cage. The night after we buried Chloe in a shallow grave dug into the ashen soil, the lodge changed. It was no longer a haven. The shadows in the long corridor seemed deeper, the silence between the generator's cycles more profound and menacing. Every creak of the old building's timbers, every sigh of wind against the boarded-up windows, became a source of heart-stopping speculation. We were 6, now we were 5. The simple math of it hung in the air like the cold. Fear was a tangible presence, a 6th member of our party. Reed was the most affected, though he tried to hide it behind a wall of angry pragmatism. He paced the main hall constantly, checking and rechecking the barricades we'd erected. He and I fell into a pattern of terse, clipped arguments. He insisted on more fortifications, more aggressive patrols inside the building, treating the threat as something purely physical that could be kept out with enough wood and nails. "A grizzly could still get through that," he'd snap, pointing at the patchwork of planks over the broken lounge window. "We need to brace it from the inside with furniture." "A grizzly would have left tracks, Reed," I'd counter, my patience worn thin. "This is something else. We need to be smart, not just build walls." "Oh right, the something else theory. What's your expert ranger analysis on that, Cameron? A ghost bear? We're dealing with a hungry animal, and your nature boy mysticism is going to get us all killed." The tension was a poison, seeping into our fragile community. Ella tried to mediate, appealing to logic, while Doyle just kept to his work, his silence a heavy judgment on us all. Only Nora seemed to be sinking inward, her watchfulness taking on a new, unnerving intensity. The sounds started on the second night. I was on the first watch, sitting in a worn leather armchair by the fire, a heavy tire iron resting across my lap. The generator was off, and the only light was the flickering orange of the flames. The lodge was a tomb of silence. Then I heard it, a faint, dry scratching sound. It seemed to be coming from the far side of the great hall near the main staircase. I froze, listening. It came again, a slow, deliberate scrape. 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 It sounded like a large branch dragging against the outer wall. But there was no wind tonight. The ash fell straight down in the beams of my flashlight when I'd checked the perimeter earlier. I got up, moving silently across the thick carpet. The sound was coming from the wall, from inside the wall. I pressed my ear against the cold wood paneling. It was louder now. A heavy, dragging, shuffling noise from within the ventilation system. It was the sound of something immense, something far too large for the ducts, forcing its way through the narrow metal passages. It wasn't the scuttling of a rat or a raccoon. It was a thick, chitinous slithering, the sound of a snake that had swallowed a deer, its scales rasping against the galvanized steel. The sound moved slowly upward, toward the second floor, and then faded. I stood there for a long time, the back of my neck prickling, my heart a cold hammer in my chest. The next night it was Nora who saw it. She'd been unable to sleep, her mind replaying the horror of Chloe's death. She sat curled in a window seat on the second floor, in a small library overlooking the eastern slope. We'd left the boards off this window. It was 20 feet up and faced a sheer drop, seemingly inaccessible. She was just staring out at the endless, silent fall of ash, the landscape a series of gray-on-gray shapes under the perpetual twilight. She told us about it the next morning, her voice small and trembling, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond anything we'd felt so far. "I was just watching," she whispered, twisting a loose thread on her sweater. "It's hypnotic, the way it falls. And then I saw something move, down by the tree line." We all leaned in, listening intently. Even Reed was silent. "It was tall," she continued, struggling for words. "So tall and thin, it almost looked like one of the dead trees. But it was moving. It didn't walk like a person or an animal. It was jerky. It moved with this horrible, disjointed grace, like a puppet on tangled strings. One moment it was still, the next it lurched forward 10 feet in the blink of an eye. Nora. It was probably just a trick of the light, the falling ash." Ella began gently. "No," Nora insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "It stopped." At the edge of the woods, it just stood there, and it turned its head. It turned to look right at the lodge, right at my window. Her breath hitched. It didn't have a normal shape. Its arms, they were too long, and its legs, when it moved, it was like they had too many joints, like a spider's. She buried her face in her hands. It just stood there for a minute, watching, and then it was gone. It didn't walk away. It just folded itself into the shadows and vanished. A heavy silence filled the dining hall. I looked at the faces around the table. Ella looked concerned, but skeptical. Doyle's expression was unreadable stone. Reed scoffed, breaking the spell.
"Oh, for crying out loud," he said, throwing his hands up. "Now we're seeing monsters in the trees? Lack of sleep, stress, malnutrition. It causes hallucinations, you know. We're all on edge. Chloe was killed by a starving animal, and now we're letting our imaginations run wild."
He turned on me. "And you? You're supposed to be the one keeping us grounded. As a park ranger, you should know better than anyone what desperation does to animals. You should have anticipated this. You should have had us better prepared instead of encouraging this ghost story." "This isn't about what I should have done, Reed," I shot back, my own fear making me angry. "This is about what's happening now." Nora saw something. "She saw a tree branch sway in the wind," he yelled, his face red. "We need to focus on real threats, not fairy tales." The argument raged, ugly and pointless, fueled by our shared terror. But as Reed ranted, I watched Nora. She wasn't hysterical. She was describing what she saw with the careful, observational detail of a scholar. And deep in my gut, a place honed by years of watching the subtle, unspoken signs of the wilderness, I knew she was telling the truth. The scratching in the walls, the impossible wounds on Chloe, the thing in the trees. They were pieces of a puzzle I couldn't comprehend. Reed could call it a grizzly, Nora could call it a monster, Ella could search for a scientific explanation, but whatever it was out there, and it was watching us. The walls we had built were no longer just keeping the cold out. They were keeping us in. The days that followed were thick with a cloying, silent paranoia. Reed's loud skepticism did little to ease the tension. If anything, it made it worse, forcing the rest of us to swallow our fear. We moved through the cavernous lodge in pairs, nobody daring to walk the long, shadowed corridors alone. The scratching sounds in the vents became a nightly occurrence, a slow, predatory exploration of our sanctuary. Sometimes we'd hear it directly above our sleeping quarters, a dry, rasping weight dragging itself through the metal ducts, and we'd lie awake on our makeshift beds, staring into the darkness, listening to the monster in the machine. Nora grew more withdrawn, spending most of her time in the small second-floor library where she'd seen the creature. It was as if she felt compelled to return to the scene, to find an answer in the one place that had always offered her comfort: books. The library was a time capsule of a forgotten world. Shelves of best-selling thrillers and celebrity biographies stood next to glossy coffee table books about skiing and the natural beauty of Montana. It was a monument to leisure, a bitter irony in our new reality. I found her there one afternoon, a thick leather-bound book open on the table in front of her, the beam of her flashlight illuminating the yellowed pages. She was so engrossed she didn't hear me approach. The air was cold in the library. It was too far from the main hall to get much warmth from the fire. "Finding anything interesting?" I asked softly, not wanting to startle her. She jumped, her head snapping up. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear. It was a feverish, intellectual excitement. "Cameron, I think "I think I found something," she said, her voice breathy. She gestured to the book. It was old, the title on the spine embossed in faded gold leaf. Voices of the Mountain, the folklore of the Apsaluki people. "Most of these books are just tourist junk," she explained. "But this is different. It's a collection of oral histories, compiled by an anthropologist from the University of Montana back in the 1920s. He lived with a local tribe, recording their stories. She turned the book around for me to see. She had it open to a chapter titled, "The Old Spirits of the High Peaks." There were no drawings or illustrations, only dense blocks of text, transcriptions of stories told by tribal elders. Nora's finger traced a specific passage. "I was looking for anything, any local legends about strange creatures in the mountains," she said. "And I found this. They told the anthropologist about a spirit they feared above all others. They called it Ga." She stumbled over the pronunciation, a guttural sound deep in the throat. "It translates roughly to the first hunger or the hunger before light." A chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature traced its way down my spine. I leaned closer, reading over her shoulder as she illuminated the text. "The elder, 2 moons, speaks. It is not a creature of flesh, like the great bear or the mountain cat. It is a hunger-given form. It sleeps in the warm heart of the mountain, where the earth is deep and the rock is alive with heat. The old ones said it was born in the time before the sun first warmed the world, when all was cold and dark and ash. It is of that time. It belongs to the gray." "Go on," I whispered, my mouth suddenly dry. Nora's finger moved down the page. "It will wake when the sun dies again and the air turns to stone. When the sky is a shroud and the world forgets the warmth of day. It does not hunt for meat to fill a belly. Its hunger is for warmth, for the heat in a living body, for the fire of fear in a human heart. It draws the heat from you, leaving only cold, empty flesh. The old ones would leave offerings of fire in the high caves during the longest, darkest winters, not for warmth, but to appease its slumber." My mind flashed to Ella's words about Chloe's body. Desiccated, as if something leached the life, the warmth, right out of her. "It gets worse," Nora said, her voice trembling as she turned the page. "It has no true shape of its own, for it is only hunger. But it is clever. It wears the shape of a man to move through the world of men, but the shape is wrong, a mockery. Its limbs are too long, for it mimics the stretching shadows of dusk. Its joints bend in ways they should not, for it knows no bones. It moves in silence, for it is the silence between heartbeats. It is the fear that what you see in the corner of your eye is real." The description was nauseatingly precise. A tall, thin figure, limbs with too many joints, jerky, unnatural movement. It was exactly what Nora had described seeing in the tree line. That evening we gathered around the fireplace. The generator was running, its hum a frail barrier against the oppressive silence. Nora, her voice shaking but clear, read the passages aloud to the others. The effect was profound. Reed, who had been so dismissive, sat stone still, his face ashen. The cynical armor he wore had been shattered, replaced by a raw, primal terror. This wasn't a grizzly bear. This was a nightmare given a name. It can't be real," Ella murmured. But her voice lacked conviction. She was a woman of science, of observable facts and diagnoses. But the legend fit our horrifying facts too perfectly. Some kind of cryptid, then. A species that went into hibernation, a troglobite adapted to geothermal vents? The ash cloud could have changed the atmospheric pressure, triggered its emergence. She was trying to fit it into a box she could understand, to wrap it in the comforting language of biology. But the words from the old book echoed in the high-ceilinged room, words of a hunger born before the sun. It says it feeds on fear, Reed stammered, his eyes darting toward the darkened corners of the hall. Is that what it's been doing? Scratching in the walls? It's just playing with us? The question hung in the air, more terrifying than any answer. We were no longer just prey. We were a source of entertainment, a meal to be savored. As if on cue, from the floor above us came a sound. Not the familiar dry scratching from the vents. This was a loud, splintering crack, followed by a deep, resonant thump against the floorboards of the room directly overhead. It was a sound of deliberate, immense force. We all fell silent, our heads tilted upward, listening. Another thump, harder this time, shaking dust from the ceiling beams above the fire. It knew we had found its name. It knew we understood what it was. The time for hiding in the shadows and whispering in the walls was over. The hunt had begun in earnest. The heavy thuds from the floor above were a declaration of war. The creature, the Ga, as we now called it in hushed, fearful tones, had shed its pretense of stealth. It was no longer just a creeping dread in the periphery. It was a physical, aggressive presence, and it was testing the limits of our cage. What the hell was that? Reed hissed, scrambling to his feet and grabbing a fire poker. It's directly above the north guest wing, I said, my voice low and steady, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. Doyle, stay with Nora and Ella. Reed, you're with me. We moved through the darkened corridors, our heavy-duty flashlights cutting sharp, nervous circles in the gloom. The generator was off for the night, and the lodge was a maze of absolute blackness outside the immediate circle of our beams. Every familiar painting of a mountain landscape on the walls seemed to watch us pass with malevolent eyes. The silence was absolute, the thudding having stopped as suddenly as it began. We found the room. The door, a heavy oak panel, was still closed and locked, but 3 deep vertical gouges were carved into the wood, splintering it to the core. They were perfectly parallel, just like the wounds on Chloe. It looked as if a giant 3-pronged rake had been slammed into it with impossible force. It didn't even try to break it down, Reed whispered, his bravado gone, replaced by a boyish terror. It was just showing us it could. That was the start of its new game. For the next 48 hours, it tormented us. The quiet scratching in the vents was replaced by loud, violent attacks on the building itself. A sudden, deafening bang on a boarded-up window in the east wing would send us scrambling, armed with makeshift weapons, only to find nothing but silence when we arrived. Then, minutes later, a horrible scraping sound like metal claws on stone would echo from the main chimney, forcing us to rush back to the great hall, our hearts pounding. It was everywhere at once. It was a phantom, striking and vanishing, never letting us rest. It was demonstrating its speed, its strength, its ubiquity. It was methodically mapping our defenses, and more importantly, our reactions. It was learning how we moved, how we communicated, how we feared. It was a master predator, and it was enjoying the chase. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. We took shifts, 2 at a time, huddled by the fire, listening to the siege. The strain was etching deep lines into everyone's faces. Ella's clinical composure was fraying. She jumped at every sound. Reed's anger had curdled into a brittle, simmering panic. Doyle remained a rock of grim silence, but even his hands, I noticed, trembled slightly as he cleaned and oiled the small generator parts. On the 3rd night of the siege, I was on watch with Nora. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a weak, pulsing red light. The creature had been quiet for hours, a silence that was somehow more unnerving than the noise. "Why do you think it stopped?" Nora asked, her voice a bare whisper. She was staring into the darkness beyond the fireplace, towards the great unboarded panoramic windows of the second-floor mezzanine that overlooked our main hall. "Maybe it's tired," I said, though I didn't believe it for a second. "The book said it doesn't tire," she replied, her voice flat. "It's a hunger. Hungers don't get tired." As she spoke, a sound from outside drew my attention. A faint crunching in the ash. Not a bang, not a scrape, but a single, deliberate footstep. I grabbed my flashlight and moved silently to one of the narrow peepholes we'd cut in the boarded-up main doors. I shielded the flashlight's lens with my hand, allowing only a sliver of light to escape, and pressed my eye to the hole. The world outside was a study in shades of gray. The ash fell softly, relentlessly. For a moment, I saw nothing but the dead trees at the edge of the parking lot. Then, something moved. It stepped out from behind the black shape of a buried snowcat. It was exactly as Nora had described it, but seeing it for myself squeezed the air from my lungs. It was impossibly tall and emaciated, its body a thing of stretched ligaments and pale, tight skin over a framework of alien bone. It stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its limbs were long and spidery, and it moved with a horrifying, unnatural fluidity, its joints seeming to bend at multiple, impossible angles. It wore a vague, distorted mockery of a human form, but it was no more human than a scarecrow. It walked slowly towards the lodge, its bare, elongated feet making no more sound than the falling ash. It stopped about 30 feet from the doors, directly in my line of sight, and slowly, deliberately lifted its head. My blood turned to ice. Its face was a smooth, pale, oblong horror. There was no mouth, no nose, just a suggestion of features, like a sculpture worn down by a million years of wind. And where its eyes should have been, there were only 2 dark, hollow pits. They weren't empty sockets. They were deeper than that, like holes punched through to some infinite, hungry blackness. They were voids, and they were staring directly at the peephole, directly at me. It knew I was there. It had known all along. This wasn't a random patrol. It had led me here. It had wanted me to see it. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to pull back, to run, but I was pinned by that vacant, all-consuming gaze. There was no malice in those pits, no anger or rage like you'd see in a bear. There was only a cold, ancient, and patient hunger, a hunger that had waited in the dark heart of the earth for eons, and now that it was awake, it had all the time in the world. It raised one of its long, 3-fingered hands, the fingers like sharpened reeds of bone, and pointed. Not at me, but up, towards the 2nd story of the lodge, towards the back of the building. Then, from that direction, came the sound of shattering glass. It had been a diversion. While I was frozen, mesmerized by the thing at the gate, another one, or the same one moving at impossible speed, had just broken into our fortress. The sound of shattering glass from the rear of the lodge broke the creature's hold on me. I stumbled back from the peephole, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "It's in," I yelled, my voice raw. "2nd floor, back of the building." Panic erupted. Reed grabbed a heavy iron, Doyle hoisted a fire axe. We thundered up the grand staircase, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The creature outside was gone. The view from the peephole was once again empty, lifeless gray. It had been a feint, a perfectly executed piece of psychological warfare. We found the source of the noise in a small guest room at the end of a long corridor. The window was smashed, its frame splintered. Cold, ash-laden air swirled into the room, carrying the sulphurous smell of the outside world. Shards of glass littered the carpet like jagged ice. But the room was empty. There was no sign of the creature. A few long, deep scratches marred the wallpaper, but that was it. "It's gone," Ella said, her breath misting in the cold air. "It broke in and just left?" "It's playing with us," Doyle growled, his knuckles white on the handle of his axe. "Hurting us, keeping us running." We boarded up the broken window, our movements frantic and clumsy. The security of our fortress was a lie. It could get in whenever it wanted. The walls weren't for keeping it out. They were just the boundaries of our terrarium. The true, soul-crushing horror began later that night. We were all huddled in the main hall, too terrified to separate. The fire was our only comfort, a fragile circle of light in an ocean of darkness. Nobody spoke. We just listened. For hours there was nothing but the crackle of the logs and the mournful sigh of the wind. Then a new sound came, faint at first. From the corridor leading to the guest wings, it was the sound of someone weeping, a soft, heartbroken sobbing that echoed eerily in the silent lodge. We all froze, exchanging terrified glances. The sound was horribly familiar. "Help me," a small voice whispered from the darkness. It was a girl's voice. It was Chloe's voice. "Oh God," Reed breathed, his face draining of all color. The voice grew a little louder, closer. "It's so cold out here. Please, let me in. I'm so cold." It was a perfect imitation. It had her exact cadence, the slight tremor of fear we'd all grown used to hearing from her. It was a flawless predatory mimicry. "Don't listen," I said, my voice a harsh whisper. "It's not her. It's the creature." But Reed was already on his feet, his eyes wide and unfocused. He had been quiet since Chloe's death, a coiled spring of guilt and unspoken remorse. He'd been the one who wanted to go on that ski trip, who had convinced her to come. Now the creature was playing his guilt like a violin. "Chloe?" he called out, his voice cracking. "Chloe, is that you?"
"Reed, no!" Ella cried, reaching for him, but he was already moving. "Reed, stop!" I yelled, grabbing his arm. "It's a trap! That's not her!"
He tried to wrench his arm free, his eyes wild. "But what if it is? What if we left her out there? We have to check." "It's not her," I snarled, tightening my grip. He was stronger than he looked, fueled by a desperate, irrational hope. Doyle moved to my side, his heavy frame blocking Reed's path to the corridor. "Please," the voice wept from the hall, seeming to be just beyond the archway now. "I'm scared. Reed, please help me." "Let go of me," Reed shouted, shoving me hard. He was completely lost to reason. He saw a chance, however slim, to undo his perceived failure, to save the girl he couldn't save before. That was the creature's genius. It didn't just hunt our bodies, it hunted our regrets. Doyle and I wrestled with him, a grunting, clumsy struggle in the firelight. He fought with the strength of a madman, his eyes locked on the dark corridor from which the pitiful cries emanated. "You're killing her," he screamed at me, his face contorted with anguish. And then the voice changed. The soft, pleading sobs morphed, stretching into something grotesque. The pitch deepened, warped, becoming a low, guttural chuckling. It was a wet, clicking sound, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a well. The sound of Chloe's voice was stripped away, revealing the alien horror beneath it. The chuckling grew into a full-throated, distorted laugh, a sound that scraped at the inside of our skulls. It was a sound of pure, ancient malice and amusement. The laugh echoed through the hall for a long, terrible moment, and then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence crashed back in. Reed stopped fighting. The strength went out of his limbs, and he collapsed to his knees, his body racked with dry, heaving sobs. The cruel reality of the trick had broken him. The monster hadn't just used a dead girl's voice, it had used his own hope and guilt as a weapon against him. We helped him back to the fire, a broken man. The incident shattered what little cohesion our group had left. The fear was no longer just of the thing outside or inside the walls. It was a fear of our own minds, our own weaknesses. Reed now looked at the darkness with hollow-eyed terror. Nora barely spoke, retreating further into herself and the pages of her book. Ella's attempts to rationalize the events grew more frantic and less convincing, even to herself. We were trapped in a box with a predator that knew our names, our faces, and the secret griefs we carried in our hearts. It wasn't just trying to kill us. It was dismantling us, piece by piece, savoring the fear as it stripped us down to the bone. The mimicry broke us. We spent the next day in a state of shell-shocked lethargy, starting at every shadow, flinching at every sound. Reed was a ghost, wrapped in a blanket by the fire, staring into the flames with dead eyes. The creature remained silent, as if content to let the poison of its psychological assault do its work. It was a new kind of terror, the quiet after the storm, where you wait for the next, inevitable strike. It was Ella who dragged us back from the brink. While the rest of us were paralyzed by fear, her analytical mind, her need for a solvable problem, had latched onto the one sliver of hope we had, Nora's book. She had taken it from Nora, who was too lost in her own fear to protest, and had been poring over the text for hours, cross-referencing passages, making notes on a bar napkin. Late in the afternoon, she called us together. "Listen," she said, her voice sharp and focused, cutting through the fugue of dread. "We've been so focused on the descriptions of the creature, we've missed the most important part." She pointed to a passage in the Ga'a chapter we had skimmed over in our initial horror. "The elder, 2 moons, speaks. It is of the time before the sun. The gray world is its home. It is strong in the long dark, in the cold, and in the shadow. But it fears the true fire, not the heat of the living which it craves, but the bright flame, the memory of the sun. The old one said that when the first dawn broke over the mountains, the Gaia shrieked and fled back into the deep places of the earth, for the light was a pain it could not bear. It sleeps in the dark and hunts in the dark." "Light," Ella said, her eyes burning with an intensity I hadn't seen since the world ended. "It fears bright light, fire. It's not just a superstition. There's probably a biological reason for it. A creature that evolved in subterranean geothermal vents would have no natural defense against intense, full-spectrum light. Its photoreceptors, if it even has any, would be overwhelmed. It would be like staring directly into the sun for us. The fire in the hearth keeps it from coming into the main hall," I realized aloud. "It's never tried to come in here directly. It just attacks the periphery." "Exactly," Ella confirmed. "But a fireplace isn't enough. It's defensive. We need to be offensive. We need something blinding, something overwhelming. We need to fight fire with fire." A spark of agency, of purpose, returned to the room. The idea of fighting back, of having a weapon against this supernatural horror, was a powerful antidote to our terror. "The fuel," Doyle said, speaking for the first time in hours. His voice was a low rumble. "For the snowcats and the plows. There's a maintenance shed out back. Should be a couple of 55-gallon drums of diesel in there." My mind started racing, the old ranger survival instincts kicking in, pushing the fear aside. Diesel is good, it's stable, but we need a way to project it, to create a massive, sudden flare. The plan began to form, a desperate, half-insane gambit born from folklore and modern mechanics. We would lure the creature into the grand lobby, our designated kill box. It was the largest open space in the lodge, filled with flammable furniture. We'd turn the entire room into a funeral pyre. "I can build it," Doyle said, a flicker of his old self returning. He stood up and started pacing, sketching ideas in the air with his greasy hands. "The kitchen has a high-pressure sprayer for cleaning the floors. I can repurpose the pump, connect it to a fuel line. We'll need a nozzle, something to atomize the fuel into a mist, and an ignition source." "The bar," Reed said suddenly, his voice raspy. He had been listening, and a flicker of life had returned to his eyes. The chance for revenge, for action, was pulling him out of his stupor. "It's full of high-proof liquor, whiskey, vodka. We can make Molotov cocktails, for a pilot light and for secondary ignition points." The work gave us focus. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of my stomach, but now it was overlaid with a sense of grim purpose. We had a plan, a suicidal long-shot plan, but a plan nonetheless. Doyle became a man possessed. He disappeared into the basement and the kitchen, and the sounds of clanging metal and his muttered curses filled the lodge. He emerged hours later, holding a monstrous contraption. It was a portable pump connected by a thick hose to a 5-gallon canister. The hose ended in a long metal wand with a flared nozzle. It was a makeshift flamethrower. The igniter, he called it with a grim smile. While he worked, Ella, Nora, and even Reed were an assembly line of destruction in the lodge's opulent bar. They emptied bottle after bottle of expensive scotch and bourbon, filling them with a mixture of alcohol and strips of torn-up linen from the laundry room. They worked in silence, the clinking of glass the only sound. They were preparing munitions for a war against a demon. I spent my time preparing the battlefield. I dragged the heaviest, driest furniture, velvet settees, polished oak tables, heavy draperies torn from the windows, into the center of the great hall, creating a massive, combustible pile directly in front of the fireplace. I planned the lines of retreat, the safest places to stand when the inferno began. By nightfall, we were ready. The main hall was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Doyle's flamethrower sat by the hearth, its canister full of siphon generator diesel. A crate of Molotov cocktails stood ready. The air was thick with the smell of fuel and alcohol, a volatile perfume of desperation. We had our weapon, forged from a dead world's forgotten stories and its mechanical refuse. Now, all we had to do was invite the monster to its own cremation and survive the fire. The plan was simple on paper, terrifying in practice. We needed more fuel. The 5 gallons in Doyle's contraption would create a great burst of flame, but we needed enough diesel to saturate the lobby, to create an inferno that the creature couldn't simply step through. That fuel was in the maintenance shed, 100 yards from the main building, across an open plaza buried in ash, 100 yards of perfect exposed hunting ground. "It has to be 2 of us," I said, looking at the small group gathered in the dim firelight. "One to pump the fuel, one to stand watch. It'll be faster that way." "I'm going," Doyle said immediately. His voice was flat, leaving no room for argument. "I know the shed. Know how the pump works. It's my job." I nodded. "I'll go with you." No, Reed said, his voice surprisingly firm. He stood up, his face pale but set. You're the best fighter we have. You need to be here to coordinate the final defense. I'll go, I owe it. He didn't say Chloe's name, but he didn't have to. This was his penance. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in days. The arrogant city slicker was gone. In his place was a man hollowed out by grief and terror, but with a hard-found resolve in his eyes. He wasn't doing this out of bravado. He was doing it because he had to. All right, Reed, I said, giving him a slow nod. Watch Doyle's back. Your only job is to scan the darkness. You see anything, you feel anything, you yell, and you both run back here. Forget the fuel. Understood? Understood, he said. The second part of the plan was the diversion. While you're out there, we need to draw its attention to the opposite side of the lodge, I explained. It's smart. It'll notice two people leaving the building. Nora, who had been silent, spoke up. The ballroom, she said, her voice quiet but steady. On the east wing. There's a sound system, a record player. If we turn it on, full volume, it's the loudest thing in the building besides the generator. It was a good idea. A sudden blast of noise from the far side of the lodge might be enough to pull the creature's attention for the few precious minutes Doyle and Reed would need. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice even. Ella, you're with me. We'll set up the main trap here. Nora, you'll be our lookout from the second-floor library window. It has the best view of the plaza. You'll give the signal when the plaza is clear. Then you get to the ballroom and start the music. Be ready to run. The next hour was a symphony of tense preparation. Doyle and Reed gathered empty 5-gallon water jugs from the kitchen, along with a hand siphon pump. They dressed in their warmest gear, faces grim. Ella and I positioned the flammable furniture in the lobby, creating channels that would direct the fire. Nora took her post upstairs. We communicated with handheld radios we'd found in the ski patrol office. After 10 agonizingly long minutes, her voice crackled through the static.
The plaza is clear, Cameron. I don't see anything. Not for the last 10 minutes. Copy that, Nora, I whispered into the radio. Proceed with the diversion. Doyle, Reed, you're on my signal. I gave Nora 30 seconds. Then a faint, tinny sound began to echo from the east wing. It grew rapidly in volume, a blast of chaotic noise. It was a record of some old big band swing music, its cheerful brassy notes twisted by the cavernous acoustics into a manic, horrifying cacophony. It was the sound of a ghost party in a dead world. Now, I said to Doyle and Reed, go. They slipped out a side door into the gray twilight, moving in a low crouch. I watched from my peephole as they disappeared into the falling ash, two small, dark figures swallowed by the vast, hostile landscape. Upstairs, Nora's voice came over the radio again, strained with fear. Cameron, the music. It's working. I hear something. In the corridor outside the ballroom, a heavy, dragging sound. It's going toward the music. Good, Nora. Get back to the main hall. Now, do not engage. Just get back here, I ordered. My attention was fixed on the peephole. Seconds stretched into minutes. The swing music blared, a frantic, looping rhythm that grated on my nerves. Where were they? It shouldn't be taking this long. Then I saw them. Two figures, emerging from the gray curtain of ash, moving quickly. But they were carrying the jugs, and they looked heavy. They were halfway across the plaza when Doyle suddenly stumbled, one of the jugs slipping from his grasp. Reed turned to help him. And in that moment of hesitation, I saw it. At the edge of the woods, a shape detached itself from the shadows. The Ga. It must have ignored the diversion, or there was more than one.
It unfolded to its full, terrifying height, its long limbs stretching. It didn't run. It simply flowed across the ash-covered ground, a river of silent, hungry darkness. It moved with an impossible speed, closing the distance in seconds.
"It's coming!" I screamed into the radio, my voice cracking. "Behind you! Run!"
On the plaza, Reed and Doyle looked up, their faces masks of pure horror. They dropped the cans and scrambled for the lodge. The creature was almost on them, its long, three-fingered hands outstretched. They were not going to make it. Time seemed to stretch and warp. As the creature bore down on Doyle and Reed, a blur of pale limbs and ravenous shadow, I saw Reed do something I never would have expected. He shoved Doyle forward, hard, sending the older man stumbling towards the door. Then he turned, a metal fire poker I hadn't even realized he was carrying held in a two-handed grip, and faced the monster. It was a futile, insane gesture. A final, desperate act of defiance from a man who had been defined by fear. The Gaia didn't even slow down. It swatted the poker aside with a contemptuous flick of its long arm, the metal flying away into the ash. It descended on Reed, and for a split second he was enveloped in a tangle of limbs that bent at sickening, impossible angles. I heard a single choked cry cut short. Doyle, propelled by Reed's sacrifice, crashed through the side door, slamming it shut behind him. He collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, his face a mess of terror and disbelief. He saved me," Doyle wheezed. "The kid, he saved me." There was no time for grief. Nora and Ella dragged Doyle away from the door as a thunderous impact shook the entire frame. The creature was right outside, pounding on the wood. "The fuel," I yelled. "Did you get it?" Doyle nodded, pointing a trembling finger at the 2 5-gallon jugs he'd managed to carry back. "It's all we got. 10 gallons. It would have to be enough."
"Barricade that door," I ordered Ella and Nora. "Doyle, with me, now." We worked with the frantic, precise energy of the doomed. While the women shoved a heavy oak sideboard against the door, Doyle and I unscrewed the caps on the fuel jugs. The pounding stopped. A terrifying silence fell, more menacing than the assault. It was listening. It was waiting. "It's going to find another way in," Doyle said, his voice grim. "It knows the building now." "Let it," I said, my voice cold. I began splashing the diesel fuel over the pile of furniture in the center of the hall, across the expensive carpets, up the heavy drapes. The pungent smell filled the air, sharp and clean. We were creating a zone of death. This is where we end it. We emptied both cans, the dark liquid soaking into wood and fabric. Doyle took his position with the flamethrower near the grand staircase, giving him a clear line of fire but also a path of retreat. Ella and Nora crouched behind the massive stone support of the fireplace, a crate of Molotov cocktails between them. I stood near the main entrance, a single prepared bottle in my hand, my lighter's flint feeling cold and alien under my thumb. "Kill the lights," I whispered. The switch was near me. I flipped it. The generator was still humming in the basement, but our designated kill box was now plunged into near-total darkness. The only illumination, the faint red glow from the fireplace embers. We waited. The silence was a living thing. It pressed in, broken only by our own ragged breathing. My senses were on fire. Every creak of the old lodge, every soft crunch of falling ash outside sounded like the approach of death. It came from the mezzanine. We heard the tinkle of broken glass from the second-floor lounge, the one Chloe had been found near. Then, a slow, heavy scraping sound.
A dark, elongated shape appeared against the faint gray light of the shattered window upstairs. It was a silhouette of impossible angles and profound wrongness. It flowed over the mezzanine railing like smoke, landing on the main hall floor without a sound. In the deep shadows, it was just a shifting patch of absolute black. It paused, and I could feel its alien senses probing the darkness, tasting the air, smelling the fuel, the fear, the life. It began to move slowly, deliberately, towards the center of the room, towards the pile of fuel-soaked furniture. It was curious, confident. It had no concept of a trap. It reached the edge of the fuel-soaked carpet. I could see its form more clearly now in the ember light. The pale, tight skin, the long, multi-jointed limbs, the horrifying blank face with its two bottomless pits for eyes. It lowered its head as if sniffing the offering we had left it. "Now," I breathed. I flicked the lighter. The small flame was a defiant star in the darkness. I lit the rag on my bottle and hurled it in a high arc. It sailed through the air and smashed into the center of the pyre. The world erupted in a roar of light and heat. The fuel ignited with a concussive whoomph, a wave of searing air washing over us. A column of fire roared 30 feet high, momentarily turning the cavernous hall into a vision of hell. And in the heart of that fire, the creature was revealed. It shrieked. It was not a sound of pain. It was a sound of cosmic outrage, a sound of pure, unadulterated hate from a thing that had never known true light. The walls of the lodge trembled with the force of it. For a single blinding instant, the flames burned away the illusion, the borrowed human shape, and we saw its true form. It was a chaotic, writhing mass of what looked like charred sinew and blackened bone, a nightmarish tangle of limbs that spasmed and tore at itself. The fire clung to it, but it didn't seem to be burning it in a conventional way. It was agitating it, torturing it, forcing it into a state of agonizing frenzy. "Doyle!" I screamed over the roar. Doyle raised the wand of his flamethrower and squeezed the trigger. A jet of liquid fire shot across the room, engulfing the shrieking entity. The monster thrashed wildly, a maelstrom of shadow and flame, and then it charged. It moved with an unholy speed, a living inferno, straight at Doyle. Doyle stood his ground, hosing it with fire, but the thing was unstoppable. It crashed into him, and for a horrible second, the two figures merged. The old mechanic and the ancient demon, both wreathed in the same cleansing fire. They fell together into the heart of the burning pyre. The shrieking stopped. The only sound was the roar of the fire consuming our sanctuary. The fire burned with a furious, hungry life of its own. It consumed the pyre we had built, then greedily climbed the heavy drapes, licking at the massive timber beams of the vaulted ceiling. The heat was a physical blow, driving us back, our faces scorched, our eyes streaming from the thick, acrid smoke that filled the great hall. There was no sign of the creature, no sign of Doyle. They had been consumed together, erased by the inferno we had unleashed. We retreated, choking and stumbling through the service corridors and out a kitchen exit into the gray, frigid air. We huddled together by the corner of the building, watching as thick black smoke billowed from the shattered windows of the main hall. A funeral pyre for our friend and our fortress. We had won. The thought was hollow, tasteless. The cost had been too high. Ella had managed to grab her medical bag. She tended to Reed, who had suffered deep gashes and what looked like a dislocated shoulder from his brief, suicidal stand. He was in shock, shivering uncontrollably, muttering Chloe's name. He had bought us the seconds we needed, he and Doyle, Our victory was built on their bodies. The fire raged for hours. We watched as the heart of the Granite Peak Lodge burned, the roof of the great hall eventually groaning and collapsing inward with a shower of sparks that momentarily lit the ashen sky. Then, slowly, as the fuel was spent, the flames began to die down. By the time the gray twilight began to feel like morning, the fire had exhausted itself, leaving a smoldering, blackened skeleton where the grand lobby had once stood. Silence returned. A profound, ringing silence, even deeper than before. The ever-present sound of the generator in the basement had finally died, its fuel lines likely severed by the fire. The lodge was truly dead. The three of us, me, Ella, and Nora, stood at a distance looking at the ruin. We were exhausted, battered, and caked in soot and grime. We had faced the monster and survived, but the relief I expected to feel was absent. There was only a vast, empty weariness. "Is it over?" Nora whispered, her voice raspy from the smoke. "The one in the lodge is gone," I said. My words felt heavy, pointless. "It's over for now." We spent the day salvaging what we could from the less damaged wings of the building. We found some untouched food, blankets, bottled water. We moved our meager camp to the ski rental shop, a smaller, separate building that was cold and stark but structurally sound. Reed lay on a makeshift bed, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of our situation. We had defeated the Gaia. We had proven that the ancient nightmare could be hurt, could be killed. But as I stood in the doorway of our new, cramped shelter, staring out at the unchanging, desolate world, a chilling thought took root in my mind. We hadn't fought the monster. We had fought a monster. The legend didn't speak of a singular entity. It spoke of a type of spirit, a hunger born of the ash and the dark. The one that had tormented us, learned our fears, and mimicked our dead was gone, incinerated in its own hunting ground. But the world that had birthed it remained. The sun was still a pale smudge behind a permanent veil of gray. The ash still fell, a soft, endless whisper, burying the world deeper every day. This was the creature's world now. We were the intruders. As the perpetual dusk deepened into what we called night, I walked to the edge of the ruined plaza, my boots crunching in the thick layer of new ash that was already covering the scorch marks of our battle. I stared up at Granite Peak, its jagged summit lost in the swirling gray clouds. My eyes scanned the base of the mountain, the dark cliffs and stands of dead skeletal pine. And then I saw it. It was far away, maybe half a mile down the slope, near the base of a rock face. A thin, almost invisible plume of steam rising from the mouth of a deep, dark cave. It coiled upward into the cold air, a slow, steady exhalation. It looked like the world itself was taking a breath, like something ancient, vast, and alive was still stirring in the warm, deep heart of the mountain. We had won the battle. We had burned down our prison and killed our jailer. But we were still trapped in the wilderness. And out there, in the cold and the endless gray twilight, the first hunger was not dead. It was just sleeping, and it had brothers.